Linda mentioned that in the Easter eggs that the kids were finding last week, there were sometimes little jokes and puzzles. One of the boys got one and it said, why did the egg hide? Because it was a little chicken. There you go. I think that falls under the category of dad jokes, which rhymes with bad jokes. It is really hard for us to even imagine what it must have been like for the close followers of Jesus after his death. What fear, what sadness, what confusion, what hopelessness must have invaded their lives. Because this was the man that they had almost staked everything on. Left their jobs, all their time, their reputation, their livelihood, and now that man had been taken and killed. And then somehow he's back. He's risen. He's there. Except poor Thomas isn't there when the risen Jesus appears to the rest of the followers. So poor Thomas isn't able to look Jesus in the eye and rejoice. Poor Thomas doesn't have this experience of hope yet. He's still left with the hurt that comes from losing Jesus. Hope and hurt. Virginia was 19 years old and she was pregnant when she went to live in the 15th foster home. Her case file read like a textbook example of neglect, abuse, and bureaucratic failure. So she sat silently in a chair, her hands neatly clasped in her lap, staring down. The foster parents, whose 3 children were in school at the time, they had been told fully of Virginia's story, and they had been promised that this placement would only be temporary. Temporary, it seems, was the story of Virginia's life. Finally, the foster mother said, "Are you frightened, Virginia?" "Yeah, kinda," she replied without even looking up. And then, "I've been in a lot of different homes." "Well," the sympathetic woman tried to reassure the bewildered young mother-to-be, "let's hope this time turns out for the best." And Virginia's response is one of those statements that kind of just sticks to your soul. It was flat, no emotion, no change of tone, and without even looking up, Virginia said, "It hurts too much to hope." It hurts too much to hope. Can you imagine? Thomas could. Thomas was not present to experience the joy. And so he said, "Unless I see the nail holes and I put my hands into his gaping wounds, I will not believe." And now it takes a full another week for Jesus to reappear to the disciples. And this time, as you heard and as you know, Thomas was with them. He is waiting. That week, sadly, has been enough to brand poor Thomas as the ultimate doubter, the skeptic that demanded proof. And I must say that hardly seems fair, because he wasn't the only disciple in the Gospels to express disbelief or doubt at the reports of the resurrection. Peter and John had to both go and see the empty tomb for themselves rather than to rely on the word of the women. But it's also unfair, I think, because it doesn't quite fit who Thomas is when all the evidence pointed to the contrary. Thomas stuck around. In spite of the doubts, he stayed and waited, waiting to see if Jesus would return. And I wonder what made him stay after such an adamant refusal to believe his friends' reports. Perhaps he wanted to see if Jesus was true to his word, that he would, as he had once promised, go at all costs in searching for that one lost sheep wandering in the darkness. Maybe he wanted to prove his friends wrong. Maybe he had something deeper than belief in the resurrection. Maybe he had faith in Jesus. So he waited in the darkness of his own unbelief for the ghost of God to reappear and breathe on him too. Now, this to me is more difficult and more courageous than the simple act of believing. The fact that Thomas waits while disbelieving, I think that's the very definition of faithfulness, if not faith itself. Sure, Thomas rather stubbornly refuses to believe his friends, but he demonstrates faith that can move mountains, or at least pin one's doubts to a room to wait on the return of the long-dead Lord. And in my experience, the latter is more frustrating, but more miraculous even than any other work of faith, to have the courage to wait. And yet we know him as Doubting Thomas. When truth, he should be labeled Thomas the Brave. I think it's time for us to put away that phrase, Doubting Thomas. Earlier in John's Gospel, Thomas is the only disciple with the courage to follow Jesus no matter the cost. It wasn't Peter the Rock. It wasn't John the Beloved. It wasn't the sons of thunder. It wasn't the zealot. A story a few chapters earlier when Jesus hears that his dear friend Lazarus has died. The other disciples try to talk him out of returning to Bethany, which was very close to Jerusalem. The last time they were there, all hell broke loose. They were threatened with death. People were holding stones ready to kill Jesus. They were run out of town. They were made to feel in no uncertain terms, you are not welcome here. So the disciples believed that returning to Bethany, even to mourn the dead, would end up in death for them all. So while the other disciples hem and haw about not going and trying to convince Jesus this isn't the time to go, Thomas alone speaks up. And Thomas alone stands in solidarity with Jesus. Thomas says, let's go with him so that we may die with him. Those aren't the words of a doubter. Those aren't even the words of a believer. Those are the words of a follower. In all of the Gospels, this is the only moment when one of the disciples, when faced with the possibility, affirms Jesus' inevitable death. Whenever Jesus speaks of his death, the disciples typically try to talk him out of it, change the subject. In one memorable exchange, things get so heated between Jesus and Peter that Jesus rebukes him and calls him not the rock upon whom the church was going to be built, but he calls him his ultimate adversary. Get behind me, Satan, he says directly to Peter. In any event, Thomas's willingness, eagerness almost, to die with Jesus casts his doubts about the resurrection in a very different light. Thomas's reaction to the disciples' claims to have seen Jesus resurrected is almost militant in its resistance. His reaction isn't that of a skeptic or an unbeliever. Rather, think about it. It's the reaction of a spurned lover, maybe, or a wounded friend, or someone in deep mourning. Thomas was the man who resolved to die with Jesus, if that's what following Jesus meant, and none of the others would. And when Jesus finally appears to his disciples, Thomas is the only one who misses this resurrection reunion, the only one in all the Gospels who accepted the reality of Jesus' death and even offered to die with Jesus, is the only one who cannot see the resurrection. What do you do when it seems that everyone else but you has seen the resurrection? Well, Thomas resolved to follow Jesus still, even if it meant waiting in a room full of believers with a head full of doubt. You've heard me say this before, but there are times when I just don't know. There are times when you don't know. There are times when I have doubts. There are lots of times when I have doubts. There are times when you have doubts. There are times when I'm not sure exactly what I'm supposed to believe. But still, I want to follow. I think sometimes we put too much pressure on people to believe all the right things about the Trinity, right things about the virgin birth, right things about salvation, about heaven and hell, when in truth we don't know. And it's okay. We've just come through Easter where we sing these wonderful songs of resurrection with great gusto and certainty, but when it comes down to it, those songs are sung with a mixture of hope and hurt. We don't fully understand the meaning of the resurrection. We don't fully understand the depth of God's grace. And believe me when I say that there is a mixture of doubt even in the deepest of faiths. The diaries of Mother Teresa, I think, prove that. In those pages, she admitted her doubts. Jesus doesn't require accurate knowledge and absolute understanding without any doubt. Jesus just asks us to follow. And regardless of where you are in your personal journey of faith, regardless of whether your scale currently tips towards certainty or doubt, it doesn't matter. You can still follow Jesus. You can still follow the one who loves you and teaches you to love. Following, it seems, is much more important than knowing. Just ask Thomas. Amen.